I gave up my family for her. She gave me up for a video that framed me. My name is Julian Hayes, born into more money than most people see in a lifetime. My father, Gerald Hayes, built a real estate empire across Atlanta that made our family name synonymous with old money. The kind of wealth that came with private schools, country club memberships, and an unspoken expectation that I would marry within our social class. I met Camille Reeves during what should have been the worst week of her life. Her parents died in a car accident on I-75, a drunk driver crossing the median during a late-night storm, taking both of them instantly. I knew Camille only distantly before that night, a girl from a scholarship program my family's foundation sponsored, someone I had exchanged maybe a dozen words with at charity events. But when I heard about the accident, something in me could not simply send flowers and move on. I showed up at the funeral. I sat with her afterward, when the crowd finally thinned and she was left alone with nothing but casserole dishes and sympathy cards from people who barely knew her. I did not plan for anything to develop between us. I simply could not walk away from someone drowning that completely in grief. Over the following months, what began as consolation became something neither of us expected. Camille was sharp, fiercely independent, despite losing everyone who anchored her world. She had been playing volleyball since middle school, talented enough that college coaches had noticed her before her parents died, though the accident threatened everything, given she now had no family support and no financial resources to continue. I fell in love with her resilience before anything else. By the time I brought her home to meet my parents, nearly a year in, I was already certain I wanted to marry her. My parents did not share my certainty. "Julian, be reasonable," my mother said, the evening after Camille's first dinner with our family. "This girl has nothing, no family, no money, no connections that benefit this family in any way." My father was more direct. "Poor people are always looking for opportunity, Julian. I've watched it my entire career. She sees a way out of whatever difficult life she's been living." "She loves me," I said, though even then I understood how naive that sounded to two people who had never once prioritized love over strategic advantage. The ultimatum came on a Sunday evening. My father set down his fork with a deliberateness that told me whatever came next had been rehearsed. "Julian, this has gone on long enough," he said. "You will end things with this girl, or you will no longer be welcome in this family. Choose her, and you choose to walk away from everything. This house, this family, any inheritance, everything." "I choose Camille," I said, and I watched something close, permanently in my father's eyes. My mother did not cry. My father did not argue further. Within a week, my access to the family accounts was revoked. My name was removed from any documentation related to future inheritance. The apartment I had been living in required my departure within 30 days. His assistant handled it with the same efficiency she applied to any business matter, as though disowning his only son required nothing more than updated paperwork. I left Atlanta's wealthy enclaves behind and moved with Camille into a small apartment on the city's south side, the kind of place with thin walls and unreliable heating I had never once needed to think about before. Camille cried the first night we spent there, watching me hang my now impractical suits in a closet barely large enough to hold them. "Julian, are you sure about this? I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." "You're not the reason I'm losing anything," I told her. "My family is the reason. They're the ones choosing money over their own son." I found work within days, manual labor, construction sites, warehouse shifts, anything that paid immediately. I worked harder in those months than I had worked in my entire sheltered life, coming home each night with hands blistered in ways my private school education never prepared me for. Camille continued training whenever she could find time between her own part-time jobs, refusing to let our family's rejection derail the one thing that still felt entirely her own. I watched her practice serves against the side of our apartment building some evenings, using a volleyball she'd owned since high school. "You should be training properly," I told her one evening, recognizing even with my limited knowledge of the sport that she possessed something genuinely special. Real coaching, real facilities. "With what money, Julian?" "I found a training academy within the month, one that specialized in developing overlooked talent. The fees were more than I could comfortably afford, but I picked up additional shifts and sold the last few possessions from my old life that still held resale value. A watch my grandfather had given me, cufflinks I'd never again have occasion to wear." "Julian, this is too much," Camille said, tears forming in her eyes that seemed, in that moment, entirely genuine. "You've already given up everything for me." "I'm not giving up anything," I told her. "I'm investing in us. This is what partnership looks like, Camille. We build this together." She hugged me that evening with a fierceness that erased, at least temporarily, every doubt my father's warnings had planted in the back of my mind. I told myself, falling asleep exhausted from another double shift, that whatever I had sacrificed, watching her finally have the chance to pursue her talent properly made it worthwhile. I could not have known, in that moment of genuine hope, how completely different Camille would become once the training I funded that evening began transforming her from an overlooked talent into something the entire volleyball world would eventually notice, or that the woman crying gratefully in my arms would, within a few short years, look at everything I had sacrificed and tell me I was no longer in her class. I did not know a single question, asked casually at the edge of a celebration, would haunt me for months before I finally understood what she meant by it. Camille's training at the academy revealed something the makeshift practice sessions against our apartment wall never could. Coach Miriam Foster pulled me aside after only 3 months. "Julian, I need you to understand something," she said. "I've coached a lot of athletes. What your girlfriend has, the court vision, the vertical, the competitive instinct, that's not something you develop. That's something you're born with. She could go somewhere significant with this." I carried that conversation home with a pride that felt, in that moment, like validation for every sacrifice I had made. I worked double shifts more willingly after that, understanding each exhausted night as an investment in something larger than either of us had initially imagined. Camille progressed faster than even Coach Foster anticipated. Within a year, she earned a spot on a semi-professional league roster, the kind of stepping stone that occasionally launched careers into something far more significant. I attended every match I could manage around my work schedule, standing in cheap bleacher seats, cheering for a version of success entirely different from anything my family had ever measured. "You're going to make it," I told her after one dominant performance, her team advancing toward a regional championship that would put her in front of scouts. "Everything we've sacrificed, it's working, Camille." "We," she repeated, smiling with a warmth I still remember, even now, knowing everything that eventually followed. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Julian. You gave up everything so I could have this chance." I believed her completely. The years that followed brought steady progress. Camille moved from the semi-professional league into a development program, then into an actual professional contract with a team based in Atlanta, allowing us to remain together even as her career began requiring travel I could not always accompany her on. Her salary, modest at first, but substantially more than either of us had ever earned, allowed us to move into a slightly better apartment, though I insisted on continuing my own work. "Julian, you don't have to keep working these hours," she said one evening, watching me come home exhausted despite her contract now covering most of our expenses. "Let me take care of us for a while. You've spent years taking care of me." "I don't want to just depend on you," I told her, some part of me still carrying my father's old warnings, some quiet fear of becoming exactly the kind of man he once accused Camille of being, someone benefiting from another person's success without contributing anything genuine of his own. "That's not depending, Julian. That's partnership." I reduced my hours eventually, though I never stopped working entirely, some stubborn part of me needing to maintain an identity beyond simply being the man who had sacrificed his family for a rising athlete's success. Camille's rise accelerated further after she was recruited onto a national development squad, a program preparing emerging talent for potential international competition. This required more travel, training camps in different cities, weeks apart from the daily life we had built together. I noticed the changes gradually at first, small enough that I convinced myself I was imagining them. Phone calls grew shorter. Text messages arrived with less warmth. When she returned from camps, she seemed distracted in ways she hadn't been during our earliest years. Her attention pulled toward teammates and coaches, and a competitive world I understood less the further she advanced within it. "How was camp?" I would ask, and her answers grew increasingly clipped, details about strategy replacing the personal stories she once shared eagerly. "Fine," she said one evening, barely looking up from her phone. "Just tired, Julian. It's a lot of pressure right now, with selections coming up." I told myself this was simply the stress of elite competition, that any partner would grow distracted under this kind of pressure. I continued supporting her schedule, continued managing our household finances as her income grew increasingly central to our survival, continued believing whatever distance had grown between us was temporary. Camille made the international roster 18 months later, a genuine milestone, placing her among an elite tier of athletes. The celebration that followed felt different from earlier ones throughout our years together, less intimate, more public, surrounded by teammates and league officials and sponsors who had begun taking notice of her rising profile. I stood at the edge of that celebration, watching Camille laugh with people I did not recognize, wearing clothes sponsors had provided that cost more than I earned in a month, and felt, for the first time since choosing her over my family years earlier, a genuine uncertainty about where exactly I fit into the life she was now building. "You did it," I told her later, once the crowd thinned and we finally had a moment alone. "Everything we sacrificed, everything we worked for, you made it, Camille." She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable behind her expression, before finally responding with words that seemed warm on the surface, but carried an undertone I would only fully understand months later. "We did make it, Julian," she said. "I just wonder sometimes if we made it to the same place." I laughed it off that night, told myself she was simply tired, overwhelmed by the pressure of her new position. I did not press her further. I did not ask what she meant, exactly, by the same place, or why her eyes drifted toward a cluster of sponsors and league executives even as she said it. 3 weeks later, I learned the answer without ever having to ask the question directly. I came home from a warehouse shift to find Camille already there, unusual given her typical training schedule, sitting at our kitchen table with a folder of glossy documents spread in front of her, the kind of professional branding materials I had only ever seen in magazines. She looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not warmth, not exhaustion, something closer to calculation. "Julian," she said, "there's someone I need you to meet, someone who's been talking to my agent about sponsorship opportunities. He wants to have dinner with us this weekend." "Your agent?" I asked. "Since when do you have an agent?" "Since last month," she said, and something in the casual way she delivered that answer, an entire professional relationship developing without a single mention to me, told me with sudden, devastating clarity that whatever distance had grown between us over the past year had already progressed further than I had allowed myself to recognize. I did not know that dinner would be the moment I finally lost the woman I had sacrificed everything to keep. The restaurant Camille chose for the meeting sat downtown, the kind of place with a wine list longer than my old college transcript, somewhere I would have recognized easily during my former life, but now felt entirely foreign walking into. Camille arrived already seated when I got there, dressed in clothes I did not recognize from our shared closet, her hair styled by someone other than herself for the first time in the years I had known her. "Julian, this is Richard Sterling," she said, gesturing toward a man rising to shake my hand, silver-haired, expensively dressed in a way that made my own clothing feel suddenly inadequate, despite my best effort to look presentable. "Richard's company has been discussing a sponsorship deal with my agent. He wanted to meet you too." "Julian," Richard said, his handshake firm, his smile the practiced kind I recognized instantly from years of watching my own father perform similar pleasantries at business functions. "Camille speaks highly of you, says you've been instrumental in her journey." The dinner proceeded with Richard doing most of the talking, discussing sponsorship figures that made my warehouse salary feel almost embarrassing by comparison, describing marketing opportunities and brand partnerships with the fluent confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating exactly this kind of negotiation. Camille listened with an engagement I recognized but had not seen directed toward me in longer than I wanted to admit, leaning forward, laughing at his jokes with a warmth that felt, watching from across the table, uncomfortably genuine. "Julian works construction," Camille mentioned at one point, when Richard asked what I did for a living, and something in the way she said it, quickly, almost dismissively, before redirecting the conversation back toward sponsorship logistics, landed in my chest like a small, precise wound. I drove home separately that evening, Camille staying behind to continue discussing details with Richard and her agent, and sat alone in our apartment, turning over everything I had witnessed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that professional networking required exactly this kind of engagement, that Camille's career now demanded relationships with people like Richard Sterling, regardless of what it meant for how she spoke about our own history together. The sponsorship deal finalized within weeks, transforming Camille's public profile almost overnight. She appeared in advertisements, local news segments covering her rise toward international competition, a level of visibility that brought its own particular pressures. I watched her navigate with increasing distance from the daily partnership we had built over years of shared struggle. Richard Sterling remained present throughout this transition, no longer simply a sponsor, but someone who seemed to appear at increasing numbers of Camille's events, training sessions, even casual dinners she began attending without extending an invitation to me. "He's just supporting his investment," Camille said, when I finally asked directly about Richard's growing presence in her life. "That's how sponsorship relationships work, Julian. You wouldn't understand. You've never worked in this world." The dismissiveness in that response, "you wouldn't understand," landed with a particular sting, given everything I had sacrificed to help her reach this exact world she now suggested I was too unsophisticated to comprehend. Camille's team advanced to the Champions League that season, a genuine pinnacle of achievement within professional volleyball, the kind of tournament that determined careers and legacies within the sport. I attended every match I could manage, cheering from increasingly distant seats as her profile grew too significant for the same casual access I once enjoyed to her pre-match preparations and post-match celebrations. The championship match itself remains, even now, one of the most complicated memories of my entire life. Watching Camille perform at a level that genuinely took my breath away, understanding simultaneously that whatever remained of our original partnership was dissolving in direct proportion to her rising success. Camille's team won. She was named tournament MVP, hoisting a trophy that represented everything we had sacrificed years earlier to make possible, and in that moment of genuine triumph, surrounded by teammates and cameras, and Richard Sterling standing prominently among the celebrating crowd, I felt something in my chest that I could only describe, honestly, as grief rather than pride. I found Camille later that evening, after the crowds had thinned, attempting to share in her celebration the way I had shared in every smaller victory throughout our years together. "We did it," I told her, echoing words I had spoken after her earlier milestone, hoping to reclaim some fragment of the partnership those words once represented. Camille looked at me for a long moment, champagne still in hand, her expression carrying none of the warmth that phrase had once elicited between us. "Julian, we need to talk," she said. "Not here, not tonight, but soon." I knew, standing in that celebratory crowd surrounded by everything her success had built, exactly what conversation she was preparing to have with me, even before she found the courage to say it directly 3 days later, sitting across from me in an apartment I had once believed represented our shared future together. "Julian, I don't think this is working anymore," she said, her voice carrying a practiced calm that told me she had rehearsed this conversation extensively before finally delivering it. "You've been amazing. Everything you sacrificed for me, I'll never forget that. But I'm in a completely different place now than where we started. I don't think you fit into this life anymore." "I don't fit," I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth despite understanding exactly what she meant by them. "Camille, I gave up my family for you. Everything I had, everything I was, I walked away from all of it." "I know," she said, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely believed this acknowledgement somehow softened what she was about to say next. "And I'm grateful, Julian, truly. But gratitude isn't the same as staying together forever. I've grown into someone different than who I was when we met. I need someone who exists in the world I'm building now, not someone who reminds me of everything I'm trying to leave behind." "Everything you're trying to leave behind," I said slowly, understanding with sudden, devastating clarity that she meant me specifically, that whatever role I once played in her survival and her rise had transformed, in her current understanding of herself, into something she now viewed as beneath the life she had built. "That's not fair," she said, though her expression suggested she knew exactly how accurately I had understood her meaning. "You'll always matter to me, Julian, but I've moved into a different class now, a different world. And I need to be honest, staying with you feels like staying stuck in who I used to be." I sat in that apartment, surrounded by furniture we had purchased together during leaner years, listening to a woman I had sacrificed my entire family and identity to support, tell me, in careful, rehearsed language, that I was no longer sophisticated enough to belong in the life my own sacrifices had helped build for her. I did not yet know that Richard Sterling had already proposed marriage the previous week, or that Camille's careful conversation with me that evening represented not an ending, but merely the first step in a plan far more calculated than simple heartbreak, one that would eventually involve people recording a moment I never expected, in a scheme designed to ensure I could never threaten the life she was building with someone who actually belonged in her new world. I did not know that the money she offered me was never meant to help me rebuild my life. It was meant to bury me. The days following our breakup passed in a fog I barely remember clearly now, the particular numbness that comes from losing not just a relationship, but the entire foundation of choices that had defined nearly a decade of my life. I moved out of the apartment within 2 weeks, Camille covering the remaining lease alone, her financial position now secure enough that my modest contribution no longer mattered to her survival the way it once had. I learned about her engagement to Richard Sterling not from Camille herself, but from a local news segment covering her championship season, a brief mention at the end of an otherwise straightforward sports story. Richard Sterling, described as one of Atlanta's most prominent real estate investors, had proposed to Camille Reeves during a private celebration following her Champions League victory, the ring reportedly valued at figures that made my entire warehouse salary from that year look almost comedic by comparison. I sat alone in the small room I now rented, staring at my phone screen, feeling something collapse inside me that went beyond simple heartbreak into something closer to existential vertigo. Everything I had sacrificed, my family, my inheritance, nearly a decade of manual labor to fund her training and support her rise, had culminated in watching her build a life with a man who could offer her apparently instantly, everything I had spent years working to provide gradually. News of my situation reached my family somehow, likely through the same social circles that had once been mine before my father disowned me. My cousin Marcus, one of the few relatives who had maintained occasional, cautious contact despite my parents' explicit disapproval, reached out with a message that confirmed exactly how thoroughly my story had become a source of amusement within the world I once belonged to. "Julian, I have to be honest with you," he said during a rare phone call. "People are talking, your parents' friends, the old social circle, everyone's saying you gave up everything for a girl who just traded up the moment something better came along. They're laughing at me," I said, less a question than a confirmation of something I already suspected. "Some of them, yeah," Marcus admitted. "Your father especially. He's been telling people this proves exactly what he warned you about years ago." I ended that call feeling a shame I had not experienced even during my hardest years of manual labor. I attempted, in the weeks that followed, to reach out to my parents directly, some desperate hope that perhaps witnessing my current circumstances might soften whatever remained of their earlier ultimatum. My father did not answer my calls. My mother responded once, briefly, a text message that confirmed exactly how little had changed. "Julian, we tried to warn you. We hope you've learned something from this experience. The door remains closed until you're ready to make better decisions about your future." I read that message repeatedly, searching for any genuine warmth beneath its clinical phrasing, finding none. It was during this lowest period, roughly 2 months after Camille ended things between us, that she contacted me directly for the first time since our breakup. "Julian, I need to talk to you," her message read, "about the money, what you spent on my training, my early career. I want to make things right." I met her at a coffee shop, neutral enough that neither of us held any particular history there, watching her arrive dressed in clothes that confirmed everything her engagement to Richard Sterling had already changed about her daily life. "I've been thinking about everything you sacrificed for me," she said, once we settled into a booth, away from other customers. "The training fees, the years you worked instead of pursuing your own career, everything you gave up with your family. I want to repay you, Julian, properly." "I don't want your money, Camille," I said, though even as I spoke the words, some practical part of me recognized how desperately I actually needed exactly what she was offering, given my current circumstances, working construction, with no family safety net remaining. "Please," she said, "let me do this. I have the resources now to actually make things right. Consider it closure, if nothing else, a clean ending, so we can both move forward properly." I thought about my father's words, about poor people always looking for opportunity, and felt a bitter irony in recognizing that circumstance had now positioned me exactly where his warnings once suggested Camille herself had started. "How much are you talking about?" I finally asked, hating myself slightly for the question. "Enough to help you rebuild," she said. "Enough to start fresh. Maybe even enough to attempt reconciliation with your family. I'll have my assistant arrange the details. We can meet next week to finalize everything." I agreed, telling myself this represented practical necessity rather than any lingering hope of reconnecting with Camille beyond this final, transactional exchange. I did not know, walking away from that coffee shop with a meeting scheduled for the following week, that this seemingly simple arrangement had already been discussed extensively between Camille and Richard in conversations I was never included in, conversations that involved considerations far more calculated than simple guilt or generosity. I did not know that the meeting they were preparing for me had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with making sure I never had the chance to threaten the life they were building together ever again. I did not know that the moment she kissed me would end with handcuffs, not with the closure she promised. I arrived at the address Camille's assistant had sent me, an upscale hotel suite rather than the office setting I had expected, uncertainty already forming in my chest before I even knocked on the door. Camille answered wearing something far more intimate than the professional attire I anticipated for what I believed was a straightforward financial transaction. "Julian, come in," she said, her voice carrying a warmth I had not heard directed at me since long before our breakup. "The paperwork just needs a few signatures." Richard's assistant drew everything up. I stepped inside, uneasy, but telling myself this was simply how wealthy people conducted business now. Hotel suites instead of offices. Unnecessary, but not inherently suspicious. Camille gestured toward a table where documents sat waiting, though she made no immediate move toward them, instead studying me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "I've missed you, you know," she said, closing the distance between us, before I fully registered what was happening. "These past few months, seeing you again today, it's brought back things I thought I'd buried." "Camille, what are you doing?" I asked, stepping back, though something in her sudden closeness had already unsettled whatever composure I'd walked in with. "Being honest," she said, and before I could process the shift in her tone, she closed the remaining distance and kissed me. I pulled back within seconds, confusion and instinct overriding whatever momentary shock had allowed the contact to happen at all. "Camille, stop. You're engaged. What is this?" That was when I heard it, a sound I initially mistook for something outside the room, until I turned and saw a phone propped against a lamp across the suite, its camera light blinking steadily, someone having positioned it there before I ever arrived. "Camille," I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn with sickening clarity, "what did you just do?" She stepped back from me, her expression shifting instantly from warmth to something colder, more composed, the mask I had mistaken for genuine feeling dropping away entirely. "I'm sorry, Julian, I really am. But Richard needed to be sure you'd never come back into our lives claiming some kind of ongoing entitlement." The hotel room door opened before I could fully process her words, two men entering, one of them holding a phone still recording, the other immediately identifying himself as hotel security who had received a call about a disturbance. "This man forced himself on me," Camille said, her voice suddenly trembling, tears appearing with a speed that only confirmed how thoroughly rehearsed this entire moment had been. "I asked him to leave, and he wouldn't stop." "That's not what happened," I said, my voice rising with a panic I had never experienced in my entire life. "She kissed me." I pulled away immediately. "Check the footage, it'll show exactly what happened." But the footage, when police eventually reviewed it days later, had been edited, the crucial seconds showing Camille initiating contact and my immediate withdrawal conspicuously absent, leaving only a version that appeared to show sustained, unwanted contact I never actually engaged in. I was arrested that evening, charged with something between harassment and assault, the specifics blurring together in my memory, given the shock that overtook me as officers placed handcuffs on wrists that had spent a decade doing honest labor to support the very woman now testifying against me. Richard Sterling arrived at the police station within the hour, playing the role of concerned fiancé with theatrical precision. His lawyer, already present, prepared documentation suggesting a pattern of concerning behavior from me that had never actually existed outside whatever narrative they had constructed together. "I just wanted him to leave us alone," Camille told the officers, wrapped in a blanket someone had provided her, tears still visible, despite the composed calculation I had witnessed only an hour earlier in that hotel suite. "I never wanted it to come to this, but he wouldn't stop contacting me, wouldn't accept that our relationship was over." I sat in a holding cell that night, replaying every moment of the past decade, understanding with growing horror that my meeting with Camille had never been about repaying old debts or offering genuine closure. It had been calculated from the beginning, a trap constructed specifically to eliminate whatever perceived threat I represented to the life she and Richard Sterling were building together, using my own sacrifice and lingering feelings against me with a precision I had never imagined her capable of. News of my arrest spread quickly through Atlanta's social circles, exactly the circles my family still occupied, exactly the audience my father had once warned me would eventually witness the consequences of choosing Camille over everything else I had been given. I learned through my cousin Marcus, during a brief, uncomfortable phone call, that my parents had seen the story on local news. "Julian, I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Your father, he just shook his head when he saw it. Said something like, 'This is exactly what happens when you give everything to someone who was never worth it in the first place.'" I sat in that cell, facing charges I hadn't committed, having sacrificed my entire family and identity for a woman who had just orchestrated my public humiliation with calculated precision, understanding that whatever remained of my reputation, whatever slim chance I once held for eventual reconciliation with my family, had likely just been destroyed beyond any possible repair. I did not yet know that this arrest, devastating as it felt in that moment, would eventually lead me into a courtroom where a stranger's face would look at mine with a recognition that would change absolutely everything I understood about my own life, revealing a truth buried decades before I ever met Camille Reeves, one that would ultimately determine not just my fate in this case, but the entire trajectory of who I actually was. I did not know the judge staring at me from the bench would recognize a birthmark he had spent 20 years searching for. My trial began 3 weeks after my arrest, my court-appointed attorney warning me privately that the edited footage combined with Camille's tearful testimony made conviction almost certain. I sat in that courtroom stripped of everything, my family, my reputation, and now potentially my freedom, watching Camille take the stand and repeat the same rehearsed account she had given police that night, her performance polished enough that even I, knowing the truth, found myself momentarily doubting my own memory of what actually happened. Judge Wallace Bennett presided over the case with the measured authority of someone who had clearly spent decades on the bench, his expression unreadable as testimony proceeded through the morning. It was during a recess, as I was being escorted back toward the holding area, that I noticed him watching me with an intensity that seemed to exceed simple judicial attention, his eyes fixed on my forearm where my sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing the small, distinctive birthmark I had carried my entire life without ever once considering its significance. The trial resumed that afternoon with a request from Judge Bennett that surprised everyone in the courtroom, an unusual recess to review what he described as procedural concerns regarding the evidence submitted. I did not understand, sitting confused at the defense table, that this request had nothing to do with legal procedure and everything to do with a birthmark that had haunted this man for over 2 decades. I learned the full story only later, pieced together through subsequent investigation and Judge Bennett's own eventual explanation. 23 years earlier, his infant son had disappeared under circumstances the family had never fully resolved, a kidnapping attempt gone catastrophically wrong, an infant believed dead after the perpetrators fled a botched ransom scheme, leaving behind no body, no definitive answers, only a grieving family forced eventually to accept a loss they could never properly explain. What Judge Bennett had never known was that a stranger, a man named Thomas Hayes, my adoptive grandfather, had discovered that infant abandoned in the aftermath of the failed kidnapping, injured and alone, and rather than involving authorities who might have connected him to circumstances he feared would implicate his own family in ways he never adequately explained even decades later, had simply taken the child in, raised him within the Hayes family as a biological grandson, a secret maintained so completely that even my father, Gerald Hayes, believed until the moment of my trial that I was his biological son, rather than a child rescued and quietly absorbed into a family that already possessed the resources to make such an arrangement disappear entirely. Judge Bennett ordered a private DNA test before proceeding further with my case, a request unusual enough that my attorney warned me it might work against me, might suggest the judge harbored some undisclosed bias requiring recusal. Instead, 3 days later, in a private chambers meeting that included my parents, summoned specifically for this purpose despite years of estrangement, Judge Bennett revealed results that reshaped everything I understood about my own existence. "Julian," he said, his voice carrying an emotion I had never once witnessed from the composed jurist who had presided over my case. "I have spent 23 years searching for my son. I never imagined I would find him standing before me in a courtroom, accused of a crime I am now certain he did not commit." My father, Gerald Hayes, sat in that chambers meeting in visible shock, forced to confront simultaneously the revelation that his own father had orchestrated a decades-long deception, and that the son he had disowned years earlier for choosing love over family loyalty was, biologically, not his son at all, yet had been raised and loved as one regardless. "I raised him as my own," my father said quietly, something breaking in his composed exterior that I had never witnessed in my entire life. "Whatever else is true, Wallace, I loved that boy as my son. I disowned him, believing I was protecting our family's legacy. I never imagined I was disowning someone who was never even connected to that legacy by blood in the first place." Judge Bennett recused himself from my case immediately, given the revelation, though his subsequent actions extended far beyond simple judicial withdrawal. He initiated a private investigation into the circumstances surrounding my arrest, an investigation that quickly uncovered the edited footage, phone records between Camille and Richard Sterling, discussing the plan in explicit detail, and financial transactions suggesting the entire arrangement had been calculated weeks before I ever received her message about repaying old debts. The investigation expanded further once investigators discovered something Judge Bennett himself hadn't initially anticipated, that Richard Sterling served as senior manager within a real estate investment firm that, through a complex ownership structure established decades earlier, ultimately belonged to the Bennett Family Trust, Judge Bennett's own family, connected to me now by blood rather than simply by the coincidental discovery in his courtroom. Further investigation revealed Richard Sterling had been manipulating company funds for years, using Camille's growing celebrity and his own senior position to obscure financial irregularities that, once properly examined, amounted to substantial embezzlement, extending back long before he ever met Camille Reeves. The charges against me were dropped entirely once the manipulated evidence came to light. Charges against Camille and Richard followed shortly after. Conspiracy and fraud for the staged encounter. Embezzlement charges against Richard specifically once the full extent of his financial manipulation became clear. Camille's athletic career collapsed entirely once the scandal became public, her sponsorships withdrawn, her standing within professional volleyball's governing bodies revoked, given the fraudulent conspiracy conviction that followed. Richard Sterling lost his position, his reputation, and ultimately much of his fortune once the embezzlement investigation concluded. The couple who had once seemed to have everything left with considerably less than where either of them had started. Judge Wallace Bennett did not simply hand me a fortune once our biological connection was confirmed. Instead, during a conversation that remains, even now, one of the most significant of my entire life, he offered something far more meaningful than immediate wealth. "I'm not going to hand you a company, Julian," he told me. "You've already proven you can survive without one. What I want to offer you is a chance to build something real, starting from where your actual skills and character have already brought you, not simply because of blood we only recently discovered we share." I began working within the family's real estate investment division shortly after, starting in a position that acknowledged my business education, but required me to prove myself entirely on merit rather than inherited privilege. I worked harder in those first 2 years than I had worked even during my hardest days of manual labor, understanding that whatever opportunity had been extended to me required genuine effort to justify rather than simple biological connection. I was eventually promoted to general manager 18 months later, a position I earned through demonstrated competence rather than nepotism, my biological father watching from a respectful distance as I built credibility among colleagues who initially questioned whether my rapid advancement reflected favoritism rather than genuine capability. My relationship with Gerald and Elaine Hayes, the parents who raised me and later disowned me, remains complicated even now. We have spoken since the trial, tentative conversations that acknowledge both the genuine love they once showed me and the devastating rejection that followed my choice to prioritize love over their expectations. Whether that relationship fully heals remains uncertain, though I no longer carry the same bitterness I once held toward decisions made by people who, I now understand, were operating from their own limited understanding of a situation none of us fully comprehended at the time. I think often about the words my father once used to justify disowning me, about poor people always looking for opportunity, about having nothing to gain from people without resources or connections. I think about how thoroughly those words applied not to Camille's original circumstances, grief-stricken and genuinely without resources when we first met, but to the person she eventually became once actual opportunity and wealth entered her life, revealing a capacity for calculated betrayal that had nothing to do with the poverty my father once feared, and everything to do with choices she made once given access to something greater than what our early years together could offer her. If there is anything I would tell the version of myself who chose Camille over his entire family years earlier, sitting in that fateful dinner, listening to an ultimatum I never expected to receive, it would be this: sacrifice given freely, without expectation of return, remains worthwhile, regardless of how the other person eventually responds to it. I do not regret choosing love over my family's conditional acceptance, even knowing everything that followed. I regret only how long it took me to recognize when love itself had transformed into something calculated, something willing to destroy me entirely, rather than simply walk away with honesty and decency intact. This has been the story of Julian Hayes. Thank you for watching this journey from beginning to end.